It's not an exaggeration to claim that video games have a penchant for life in post-apocalyptic America. From the ghastly realism of The Last of Us to the tongue-in-cheek absurdity of Rage, the industry is filled to the brim with experiences that explore what happens to the land of the free after social order collapses. In addition, games like Frostpunk, Mad Max, and a few others have featured memorable post-apocalyptic scenarios in the Anglosphere. Yet when it comes to the rest of the globe, the pickings are often slim. 4A Games' Metro franchise is an exception to this. A survival-oriented first-person shooter series based on Dmitry Glukhovsky's novels of the same name, the games explore the harshness of life in Moscow after the fires of nuclear war force its inhabitants to take refuge in its metro. And it does so with one of the more hardcore set of mechanics to grace its genre. For perhaps this reason, a lack of marketing, and a not insignificant amount of technical issues that afflicted its first wave of releases, the Metro series never managed to become as beloved as some of its peers. Yet through sheer force of will, it grew into a mainstay in the first-person shooter genre, thanks to the tireless work of 4A Games and the support of its passionate fanbase. But in order to fully appreciate what the series has to offer, one must first go back to the past, to the mid-2000s, when 4A's founders had yet to leave their original outfit, and Glukhovsky's first novel had only just been published in its country of origin. This is the history of Metro 2033. In 2005, GSC Game World was experiencing one of its most challenging years since its formation. After working on the survival horror shooter Stalker: Shadow of Chernobyl for over 4 years, GSC had come to realize that it wasn't shaping up to be very enjoyable to play. While it featured one of the most realistic and dynamic worlds that the medium of games had ever seen, it struggled to provide players with a focused gameplay experience. As a result, the Ukrainian developer had been forced to go back to the drawing board and completely rework its design, as well as contend with the many technical issues these changes resulted in. It's during this time that 4 members of Stalker's core team would leave the studio to found 4A Games. Working for GSC had been a gratifying experience, but Stalker's prolonged development, which would only conclude 2 years after their departure in 2007, had made them hungry to strike out on their own. They wanted to flex their design muscles and try new things, such as creating a first-person shooter based on Metro 2033, a post-apocalyptic Russian novel set 20 years after the Earth is ravaged by a nuclear holocaust. Metro 2033 follows Artyom, a young man who has spent all but a few years of his life within Moscow's metro, on a quest to save it from a race of mysterious psionic beings known as the Dark Ones. The book had barely graced its country of origin storefronts and would take many more years to reach the rest of the world. But Russian readers and 4A's founders had been enjoying it since 2002, when its author, Dmitry Glukhovsky, posted an unfinished manuscript of the novel online after it had been rejected by a slew of publishers. In addition to encouraging Glukhovsky to finish the manuscript, these early readers provided him with continuous feedback and suggestions as he wrote and added new chapters to it, guiding the novel's creation in a highly collaborative fashion up until its completion. As a result, even though it had only just hit the presses, Glukhovsky's book already had a sizable and extremely active fan base. Sensing the potential that a Metro 2033 video game might hold, 4A reached out to Glukhovsky, and he responded in kind. The author had considerable love for video games and their unique narrative qualities, having enjoyed titles like Fallout and Sid Meier's Civilization since the age of 12. And while he had already been approached by a few other developers with similar ambitions, 4A's level of expertise was greater than anything he'd seen before. In Glukhovsky's eyes, letting the studio turn Metro 2033 into a illusory experience would be more than just flattering. It would likely result in a great new interpretation of his work. 4A Games' destiny was set, but as it would soon discover, reaching it was going to take a long time. 4A Games would spend a year incubating their opus before revealing it to the world, showcasing it for the first time at the Leipzig Games Convention in August of 2006 under the working title Metro 2033: The Last Refuge. What was shown of The Last Refuge was short and straightforward, a linear segment in which Artyom explores Pole Station, one of the many stations the Metro's inhabitants have coalesced around after it falls to an onslaught of mutated animals. But 4A promised that the final product would be much more dynamic and open-ended, with a press release issued by 4A alongside The Last Refuge's reveal, promising that the game would offer a very Stalker-esque experience. The Metro would be available for the player to explore in a non-linear fashion. The course of the story could be altered dramatically through careful decision-making, and non-playable characters would live out entire lives, irrespective of the player's involvement. Saving the last of Moscow's people from annihilation would involve more than just shooting. It would involve weaving through a model tapestry of political regimes and factions, each possessing a different vision on what life in the Metro should be and how hard everyone else should submit to it. However, as Metro 2033's development progressed, this dynamic, open-ended design gave way to a more linear and guided one. The ideologically opposed factions, lively non-playable characters, and far-reaching narrative decisions detailed when the game was first unveiled were significantly simplified, and most of the game's levels came to contain the same amount of complexity as the whole station demo, which itself became integrated into the game's fourth chapter. The team effectively realized, early on, that in order to do Glukhovsky's version of Metro 2033 justice, their adaptation scope needed to be reined in. The novel featured a wide range of locales and characters, yet they were all introduced and explored in a linear fashion. 4A could take artistic liberties with them, but if it wanted to make sure that it nailed what made them so beloved, the studio would need to present them in a narratively similar manner in the game. While this was a large deviation from what 4A had been used to making up until this point, it embraced this new direction wholeheartedly. The studio had a lot of experience working within Stalker's open-ended framework, but it was even more enamored by Half-Life 2 and its more focused, narrative-centric design. If it could create an experience that rivaled what Valve had managed to accomplish with the latter, it would be the ultimate achievement. Completing Metro 2033 would still be a challenging process for 4A. In addition to working hard on making sure their game looked and felt just as good as anything the competition would have to offer, the developers tasked themselves with excluding heads-up display elements from it wherever possible, forcing them to come up with a variety of creative workarounds to ensure critical information that would have otherwise simply been displayed on the screen was conveyed to the player in a more realistic and immersive manner. The studio also struggled for years to find a publisher interested in their work, with THQ, which had previously agreed to publish Stalker for GSC Game World, only signing on to do the same for Metro 2033 in 2009. For all the hardships 4A dealt with, however, the studio managed to maintain a good relationship with Glukhovsky throughout the entire process, with the author providing suggestions, advice, and support up until the project's completion. The studio also didn't encounter any difficulties making Metro 2033's multiplayer mode, because it decided not to create one at all. In a generation where seemingly every shooter worth its salt featured some form of online multiplayer, 4A abstained from including one with its game, with producer Hugh Bynum explaining in a 2010 interview with VG247 that they felt the value offered by Metro 2033's single-player campaign was more than worthwhile by itself. From 4A's perspective, there was no reason to tick any additional boxes when the game already had everything it needed to enrapture its audience. And enrapture them it did.
Let's get on top of here!
Колеса. Кондуктор, нажми на тормоза.
While Metro 2033 wasn't greeted by a mountain of supporters when it finally launched on the PC and Xbox 360 in March of 2010, it still managed to capture many hearts. Players were impressed with how consistently entertaining and well-paced Archam's journey through the Metro was, finding its eclectic mix of scenarios as varied as they were flush with atmosphere. From exploring a tunnel haunted by supernatural phenomena with the help of an odd mystic, to assaulting a burnt-out library alongside the Metro's military, the game almost never felt trite over the 11-odd hours it took to complete it. And as those who had read the book it was based on could attest, it did so while remaining faithful to its source material. It wasn't a one-to-one adaptation of Glukhovsky's novel. The Archam of the novel killed only a single person, for example, while the Archam of the game killed many more. But it depicted its most important characters, events, and motifs with relatively few concessions. Equal appreciation was directed at the unique mechanics and systems used by Metro 2033 to illustrate the scarcity of resources within its subterranean world. While the game provided Archam with a flashlight and night vision goggles, they both needed to be manually charged by a hand-operated dynamo. Likewise, gas masks needed to be constantly fed new filters when exploring the irradiated wastes above ground, as well as replaced when they became damaged. And military-grade bullets could either be used to give one's firepower an immediate extra kick, or conserved so that more lower-grade bullets, ability-enhancing suits, and firearms could be purchased later on. At a time when many of the video game industry's most notable survival horror titles were becoming increasingly action-oriented affairs, these elements, as well as the overall dearth of bullets within the game's environments, proved immensely pleasing. Metro 2033 wasn't overly scary in the way that Resident Evil or Dead Space were, but it succeeded in evoking a similar sense of tension. Unfortunately, these positives would be offset by a variety of niggling issues, not the least of which was the game's assortment of glitches. From small visual snags to game-breaking bugs, Metro 2033 possessed a host of technical issues. Not so many that it earned a reputation for being utterly broken, but enough to give it a reputation all the same. Many were also dissatisfied with the game's occasional stealth sections, finding the enemy's artificial intelligence in such scenarios to border on being unfair. If Archam so much as grazed an enemy's field of vision while attempting to weave around them, their entire cadre would more likely than not run immediately towards his location, with no buffer period in which they would attempt to search for him first. And while not as ubiquitous a criticism, a fair few players found the game's shooting mechanics to lack impact, complaining that enemies often didn't react at all when fired at. Despite attempting early on to break away from its spiritual predecessor's mold, Metro 2033's critical reception ended up being very similar to that of Stalker: Shadow of Chernobyl. Both were heralded for their immersive atmosphere, unique worlds, and distinctive mechanics and systems, yet panned for their frustrating and uneven levels of polish. Their harshest critics agreed that for all their flaws, they still contained a bevy of great ideas, while their kindest critics admitted that for everything great about them, there was a lot that could have been better. In the months following Metro 2033's release, both THQ and 4A would let slip that plans were underway to continue Archam's saga. Of all the games released in 2010, Metro 2033 had been far from the most popular or beloved, with THQ itself describing it as a cult hit with bugs the following year. But it had done decently by the standards that had been set for it, enough so to make 4A eager to apply everything it had learnt over the past 6 years to craft a bigger and better sequel. And if the studio needed inspiration as to where it should take its story, it wouldn't need to look very far, as Dmitry Glukhovsky had released Metro 2034, a continuation of his original novel during the game's production. Bar an actual nuclear war breaking out within the next 3 years, all signs suggested that 4A's next opus would come together under much shorter and smoother circumstances than its previous one. Unfortunately, while this project's development cycle would end up being shorter than 2033's, it would still be far from smooth. Much like Archam's journey into the bowels of Moscow's underground transit system, 4A would find its endeavors constantly threatened over the next few years by new and unusual forces, each powerful enough to tear it apart, yet unable to stop it from reaching its goal and bequeathing the world its last light. Our documentaries are crowdfunded and made possible by the generous supporters backing us on Patreon. If you enjoy our content, consider subscribing to our channel and becoming a patron to help us create more. Thank you.